Hello, everyone. Today, you will hear an interesting story. Boris's went bad. Isella was scattered and forgetful. Bright instrument lighting annoyed him too much. Seems that you're not mood today, said the ship mechanic while passing by. Boris shrugged. He didn't want to talk about anything, and in his head, anxious thoughts settled. The fact is that his wife began to behave in a strange way. Usually, when Boris was in a voyage, he communicated with his wife using video, but that day, Lena had written, "Sorry, dear, but I'm busy now. Let's communicate tomorrow." "Why so?" inquired Boris. "Why so? I've got things to do." "That's why," answered the wife. Dismay settled in Boris. However, not only dismay, irritation mixed with it. "I need to pull myself together," decided Boris, and then he peered into the darkness of Atlantic Ocean through the wide windows of the deckhouse. Of course, dismay didn't leave Boris, but irritation decreased. Besides, saving thoughts appeared in Sailor's head. They were like, perhaps Lena really couldn't communicate with me using video. She's a bookkeeper. Everything might happen. It helped, but not completely. Anyway, Boris defended his watch and went to the cabin. And in the morning, he had an opportunity to talk with Lena using video. "Hi, dear," she said kindly, and her mouth broke into a smile. "Hi," said Boris. He was standing on the starboard wing of the ship bridge. Nothing prevented him from talking with his wife. Sunshine was covered by the deckhouse. Boris could see his wife's face distinctly. Lena incidentally looked away and smiled again. Night dismay reminded itself, though Boris didn't show that to Lena. He also smiled, told about another typical day, which he had spent on the vessel. And while talking, he kept a close eye on wife's gestures. Several times she looked away, sometimes she took a thought and answered at random. Some gestures were too jerky. Looks weird? Boris thought she didn't behave in such a way earlier. And again, he tried to comfort himself with an assumption that Lena had had problems at work. It didn't work out, but instead of irritation, Boris felt depression. Things went slowly. Boris didn't respond to orders immediately. He barely defended the day watch. And then there was evening, and the wife couldn't talk to Boris using video again. "Hi, how are you?" she wrote in Messenger. "Sorry, no video communication today. I've got too much to do. We'll talk tomorrow morning." "I'm fine," answered Boris, and he felt growing dismay. And added, "Today, everything was typical. And in the morning, there was a video conversation. Everything was like a day before. Lena behaved in a strange way. The same nervous gestures, head turns, ridiculous answers. This went on for several days. Boris tried not to tell anybody about his family things, but then he broke down and shared his problem with the ship mechanic. "And maybe she cheats on you," said the mechanic while drinking tea at the starboard rail. "She never did that." Boris got indignant, but not much, because he understood the mechanic could be right. And the mechanic continued, "Think, man, we spend months in voyages and rarely come home. So what women do without us? So they cheat on us." "Get off." Boris went to the deckhouse. "I have an acquainted detective," mechanic cried after. In his cabin, Boris pondered mechanic's words nervously. He realized again that the mechanic was right. Sailors rarely came back home, and their wives were often left to themselves. They could do everything they wanted. Boris recalled the captain's story. When he had once returned from voyage, he had met his wife with some bloke. That man had nearly been murdered. Fortunately, the wife's lover had noticed a wrench in captain's hands and jumped out of the window. The captain's flat was on the first floor, so the wife's lover hadn't been injured. "Wouldn't run away from me," Boris thought with pleasure. He remembered his flat on the second floor and the concrete yard with no plants and trees. And what if the wife does have anyone? Boris thought as if someone asked from outside, and Boris ran to starboard side where he had recently communicated with the ship mechanic. Of course, there was no mechanic in that place. Then Boris ran to the engine room. "Have you seen Lvov?" He asked a sailor graduate who was in his third voyage in life. The answer was negative, so Boris had to run deeper inside of the vessel. He wandered through the bowels of the bulk carrier for a long time. Finally, he found Mechanic at the lower deck. Here you are, Talik. Later. I'm busy now, said Mechanic, doing some work. Damn it. In his thought shouted Boris. Then he went to his cabin. He met Glebov only after supper as shortly before his night watch. Glebov started first. You were looking for me today, weren't you? I was. Recently, you told me that you knew a detective whom I could hire. Yes. I know one detective. And you have decided to hire him, haven't you? I have. Please give his contacts. Gleb gave, and Boris began his communication with the detective. Good evening, answered the detective. Yours to command. Boris mustered up the courage and wrote. I need to check if my wife has a lover. Typically, replied the detective, and informed about the money to pay in advance. Boris was surprised and wanted to reply. It's too much, but he decided not to do that. Instead of that, he just agreed with everything. Then detective gave payment details and declared after he had received money tomorrow, I'll get down to business. And detective did that. First of all, he inspected the yard where there was nothing except for the concrete. However, there was a very handy lamppost just in front of Boris' flat. It's probably nice to live there, thought the detective, and then he started figuring out how to all a video cam. And he realized it's impossible without the help of specially trained people, and the detective didn't want to attract too much attention. Then the detective moved away and looked at the Boris's flat again. The strange thing was the windows were covered with curtains, though there were no houses on the other side of yard and the sun wasn't shining into the windows. The detective checked cameras in pockets of jacket and started waiting for the right moment to enter the house. Such moment came in an hour. The wait wasn't too tedious, but the detective was a bit nervous because each new deal is a new risk. Though the salary is good. Following a woman, the detective entered the house, went up to the second floor and hid one of his cameras behind the ventilation grill. The camera is small, black. It's hard to notice such one. And at that moment, he almost revealed himself. The door of nearby flat, not Boris's one, opened, and an old lady went out to the stairs. She stared at the detective, said hello, and asked, Are you a new boyfriend of that bitch? She nodded at the flat in front. Get out of here, or I'll call the police. Everyone hangs around here while her husband is at the sea. Then the detective showed his ID. The old lady looked at it carefully and said, Mikhail Zoryev, the detective. That's right. I'm just doing the Boris Valerianov's case. What has he done? Frightened the old lady. He has done nothing. He just expects his wife of cheating. That's that. One fact bastard in a tailcoat visits her almost every day. He parks his car under my balcony and is often angry when I hang up my wet clothes after washing. You see, he doesn't like when drops are falling on his car. Tell me about the car if you can. What is it? Michael, I don't know its model. The car is big, black, looks like a SUV. Don't you remember a number plate? No. That's the thing, I really don't remember. Then please note down my phone number and call me if you notice something suspicious. The old lady noted down the detective's phone number and promised I'll obviously help you. And what's your name? Asked Michael. Marina Lukianova. Goodbye, Marina. The old lady called Mikhail that evening. Detective Zoryev is listening. Good evening. It's Marina Lukianova, Boris Valerianov's neighbor. Hi, I'm glad to hear you, rejoiced Mikhail. Well, he's just arrived, Alina's lover. Just like earlier, he has parked his car under my balcony. Bitch. When did he arrive? Just recently. He's near his car, and Lena is with him. Fine. I'll call you later. He hung up and opened an application using which he could control the Vidicom. Now he had to wait. Finally, the couple appeared. Lena and her lover. The lover was really a tall fat man in a black tailcoat. He led Lena to the door, and then they started kissing. No, not like friends. They kissed in lips. Busted assholes. Pretty thought, Mikhail. He was just sitting in the park in a few blocks from Boris's home. And he decided to hurry up to that yard while walking Mikhail still, following the camera. But it showed nothing interesting after the kiss. The couple entered Boris's flat. In the yard, Mikhail noticed the car of Lena's lover. It was a black crossover Toyota with rogue number plates. Mikhail took a picture of the license plates on his smartphone and walked away from the house. The windows in Boris's flat were still curtained, but the light was on, and Mikhail noticed two silhouettes. According to their movements, they were going to spend a passionate night. Then they kissed and went into bed, and not to sleep, of course. Then Mikhail entered the house. The door had been opened by Marina Lukyanova, and leaned his ear to the door of the Boris flat. He heard groans and screams. It seemed that Lena and her lover satisfied each other in the most natural way in the world. That's it. Mikhail mentally smiled and asked his colleagues to find out full dossier per person who has a crossover with such number plates. The number plates, Mikhail, sent by messenger. The reply came in 10 minutes. It appeared that Lena's lover was Nikolai Dolbinov, a small businessman. Mikhail also received the home address, the address of the chief office of the Dominovs company. Thanks, wrote Mikhail, and sent his colleagues some money as a reward. Then he gave some money to Marina. I ask you only one thing not to tell anyone? Guess the old lady. I wasn't going to tell anyone except for Boris. Yes. Miss Lukyanova, now it's better to keep silence. Don't worry about that. Do you want to have tea with pies? I've got no time, miss. Also, Lena's lover can leave any moment, and we might meet each other. As you see, that'll make me troubles. He won't leave till morning. Mikhail pondered and decided, all right. Thank you. I will. Just don't talk about it either. I have no choice anyway. In Marina's flat, Mikhail contacted with Boris using video. While Mikhail was conducting his investigation, Boris couldn't find his place. He felt nothing except for desperate anxiety. He did his work anyhow, ate and drank through force, had a bad sleep. And he was surprised that Mikhail had finished so quickly. Good evening, said Mikhail using video communication. Are you ready to talk? Of course, I'm ready. Good evening. Well, unfortunately, you were right. Your wife does have a lover. Bitch. Boris punted the deckhouse with all his might. I'm sorry. Now I'll send you the most important paragraphs of your wife's lover's dossier. His name is Nikolai Dolbinov. He's a small businessman. Thank you very much. Now I'll pay for your work the whole amount of money. Boris paid for detective's work, studied the Dolbinov dossier and started to live with an expectation, the expectation of revenge. The way home would take 2 months, and during this time much could happen. It appeared that there was nobody to take a revenge. On returning home, Boris saw some news. They said that Nikolai Dolbinov was taken by a police due to a fraud, and he would spend next few years in prison. Well, I'll meet you when you're free, thought Boris. Looking ahead, it's time to mention that in 3 months Dolbinov would commit a suicide, and again, Boris will have nobody to take a revenge. Boris didn't meet his wife at home. Marina Lukyanova said that this bitch had met someone else. The wife's new lover turned out to be an electrician, but he also abused alcohol. I wish her to go to hell, said Boris indifferently, although inside he was all tense. That bitch knows how to find her own adventures. He thought. He had already calmed down. He had nothing left for this woman. He no longer cared about her. Lena returned home in the evening. She was drunk and trash, and the sailor said we'll soon divorce. Very well, barely standing on her feet, said the wife. Overnight in other place. It turned out quite abruptly, but Boris even rejoiced at such a tone. It took 2 months for them to divorce. All this time, Lena was drunk, but Boris had no care to that. He knew very well that in life, there is always a reckoning. Soon his ex-wife finally drank herself to death. And in a few days after Lena's death, her new lover was hit by a road train. He also died. Boris decided to completely change his place of residence and place of work. He chose Istanbul as his new city. He began to work at a tug. A few more years passed. Boris married a beautiful woman, and they had a wonderful son. In the service, he had already risen to the rank of captain, and all was well with him. Dear listeners, your support is very important to us. If you like our story, please like, comment and subscribe.